Punic War was the second of a set of wars between the Roman Republic and Carthage, this particular war having Macedonia and Namibia on the side of Carthage. The second war took place in the Italian peninsula, North Africa, and Greece from 218 to 210 BCE. The war began with the attack on Roman allies Saguntum by a Carthaginian army led by Hannibal. The war caused defeat for Carthage, and Rome annexed Carthaginian Iberia as a result. The Arminius Revolt was a conflict between Rome and several Germanic tribes over Rome's aggressive territorial expansion taking place in what is now Germany in roughly 4 CE. The revolt is known primarily for the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where 3 entire Roman legions were destroyed in an ambush. At one point in time, the Roman Emperor Caligula decided to declare war on Neptune, the god of the ocean. In order to fight the mighty Neptune, Caligula lined up troops on the shores of the town of Wittenberg, had them stab at the water, then declared victory and had the troops collect seashells as spoils. The reason for this war is often debated by historians, ranging from the idea that Caligula was simply, quote, batshit crazy, to the theory that it was a political move to embarrass the troops after they had nearly mutinied following an order to invade Britain. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was a rebellion in the Chinese Han Dynasty in 184 to 285 CE. This war between the Yellow Turban rebels and the government of China was caused primarily by an agrarian crisis, which led to huge economic problems and discontent with the already weakened Chinese government. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, leading to a Pyrrhic victory for the Han Dynasty. The Battle on the Ice was a religious war fought by the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order at Novgorod in 1242, taking place in modern-day Estonia, Latvia, and the Novgorod Oblast, Russia. The war was caused by the Pope's attempts to convert the Baltic pagans to Christianity, which angered the Russians. The war eventually spelled defeat for the Christian Crusaders and led to the collapse of the Livonian Sword Brothers and subsequent creation of the Livonian Order. The War of the Eight Saints was a conflict from 1375 to 1378 in what is now France, fought over territorial expansion of the Papal States. A council of 8 men, who referred to themselves as the Eight Saints, formed from Florence, Milan, and Siena, and sought to prevent the expansion of the Pope's territory. The war ultimately did not result in very much, except for the death of many Italians. The deceivingly named 100 Years' War was a long-lasting conflict between France and England, taking place in a large portion of Western Europe, from 1337 to 1453. The war was a result of long-lasting rivalry and tensions between the kingdoms of France and England, and was sparked in part by England's attempts to gain control of Flanders, as well as French backing of Scotland against England. This lengthy war resulted in a French victory, causing the House of Valois to retain the French throne, English claims to the French throne being abandoned, and strengthening of the French monarchy, as well as partly being responsible for the War of the Roses. The 1400 Glyndwr Uprising was a war between the Kingdom of Wales, backed by France, and the Kingdom of England. The war started as a land dispute between the Prince of Wales, Owain Glyndwr, and Reginald Grey, 3rd Baron Grey de Ruthyn of Dearfin Clwyd. The war eventually resulted in the annexation of and loss of independence for Wales. The Engelbrekt Rebellion was a peasant uprising in Sweden in 1434. The rebellion was caused by excessive taxes on Sweden by the Kalmar Union, as well as the blocking of Swedish people from exporting goods, causing extreme amounts of poverty for the country. The uprising led to the erosion of the Kalmar Union, as well as Swedish independence and establishment of democracy. The War of the Polish Priests was a war between the Teutonic Order and the Kingdom of Poland from 1467 to 1479. The war was caused when the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order invaded Varmia in order to try to take the bishop's seat. The eventual result of this conflict, however, was loss for the Teutonic Order, and the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights had to swear fealty to the King of Poland. The sack of Rome in 1527 CE was an event in the War of the League of Cognac, where a 20,000-man army of mutinous mercenaries, as the name would imply, sacked the city of Rome. The city was defended by 5,000 militiamen and 189 Swiss Guard, who were successful in evacuating the Pope from the city unharmed. The sack of the city, however, was a huge victory for the enemies of the Papal States, who were the holders of Rome at the time. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of conflicts in Europe between France and the vast majority of European countries. The wars took place, unsurprisingly, in most of Europe, as well as Egypt, from 1803 to 1815. As the name would imply, the war revolved primarily around Napoleon, mostly in his interest to expand the range of his personal rule as well as the territory of the French consulate. The war led to the redistribution of a large amount of land in Europe, as well as the restoration of the French monarchy. The Spanish-American War was a conflict in 1898 between the United States and Spain over control of the Caribbean. The war took place mostly in the seas around Cuba, as well as near the Philippines in the Asia-Pacific seas. This conflict led to American control over the Caribbean, as well as the secession of the Philippines to the U.S., which ultimately led to many problems all around. The Second Boer War was a conflict between England and the Boer states of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State from 1899 to 1902. The war was caused by tensions between England and the two Boer states and threats to the British Empire's influence in South Africa. The war ended up in a huge number of casualties for soldiers on the side of the British and civilians on the side of the Boer states. The Russo-Japanese War was a war fought from 1904 to 1905 for imperial interest of the Russian and Japanese empires. The war took place in Manchuria, the Yellow Sea, and the Korean Peninsula, and resulted in control over the area swinging in favor of the Japanese, with Russia being forced to recognize the Japanese claims in the Korean Peninsula and pull troops out of Manchuria. World War I is quite a well-known conflict, taking place throughout Europe from 1914 to 1918. The sides in the war were the Allied powers, or the Triple Entente, being led by France, England, and Russia, against the Central Powers, consisting of primarily Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The war was caused by a number of different factors, the primary ones being a rise in militarism, imperialism, and nationalism, as well as numerous alliances, finally being sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. World War I had a tremendous impact on the world, causing the dissolution of many countries, especially on the side of the Central Powers, the formation of the League of Nations, the rise of fascism, and generally setting the stage for World War II. The Russian Revolution was a peasant-based revolt in the Russian Empire during World War I, specifically in 1917. The opponents in this revolution were the government of the Russian Empire trying to stay in power, and the Bolshevik revolutionaries seeking to overthrow the Tsars of Russia. The revolution was caused by a rise in communism, as well as a general economic disparity. The revolution caused Russia to pull out of World War I, as well as to reform as the Soviet Union. The Emu War of 1932 was a terrible war between the Royal Australian Army Artillery and the emus native to Australia. The war was caused by overpopulation of emu, destroying crops and causing problems in general. In response, a group of soldiers who had recently served in World War I requested use of military equipment in order to deal with the birds. These soldiers were given a pair of Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, but they failed to put a dent in the population of emu due to the fact that large flightless birds do not use conventional infantry tactics and are actually quite hard to hit. You thought guerrilla warfare was bad. You couldn't possibly imagine emu warfare. If you thought guerrilla warfare was bad, you couldn't possibly imagine emu warfare. The Winter War was a lesser-known conflict during the early stages of World War II, from 1939 to 1940. The war was fought by Finland and the Soviet Union over the independence of Finland following the reformation of the Russian Empire. The war resulted in a massive loss for the Soviets and pushed Finland to join the Axis in World War II. World War II was the next major war following World War I, spanning from roughly 1938 to 1945 and taking place again in the majority of Europe, as well as in the Pacific Ocean and China. The two sides in the war were the Allies, consisting primarily of England, the Soviet Union, and France, with America joining later on in the war, fighting against the Axis, being led by Germany, Japan, and Italy. The war was caused in no small part by the aftermath of World War I, but was set off by the imperialist goals of Hitler of Germany and Hirohito of Japan. The war resulted in a huge number of deaths, especially for civilians, the formation of the United Nations to replace the League of Nations, a decline in imperialism for the most part, and the setting of the world powers for roughly the rest of the century. Operation High Jump was a military operation conducted by the United States in Antarctica from 1946 to 1947. The goal of the operation was mostly to establish the U.S. Antarctic research base Little America 4, which was successful. The Troubles, spanning from 1968 to 1998, was a series of conflicts in Northern Ireland, making up a civil war for the independence of Northern Ireland from the UK. The Troubles were characterized heavily by guerrilla warfare on the side of the Irish. This conflict eventually resulted in increased autonomy for Northern Ireland and a system whereby the Northern Irish could vote to leave England, if they so chose. The Iraq-Iran War was a Middle Eastern conflict between the nations of Iraq and Iran from 1980 to 1988. Both countries wanted to be dominant in the Persian Gulf, and this caused tensions to deteriorate to the point of war. The war was eventually settled by a UN-brokered peace deal, but led to instability in the Persian Gulf. The Falklands War was a war for control of the Falklands Islands fought in 1982 between the United Kingdom and Argentina. The war was set off by the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands after claiming sovereignty over them, which invoked a response from the British military. The war ultimately ended in the UK regaining control over the Falkland Islands. The Yugoslav Wars were a series of conflicts in the Balkans spanning from 1991 to 2001. The wars were caused by a sharp increase in ethnic nationalism amongst the Slavic people. The wars resulted in quite a mess for the Balkans, causing the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the formation of many successor states. The Revolt of Krieg was a civil war fought on the former high world of Krieg in the year 443 of the 40th millennium. The civil war began with the planetary governor of Krieg declaring the independence of Krieg from the Imperium of Man. Fortunately, loyalist troops under the command of Colonel Yurten managed to drive the rebels to fall back to several fortress cities. A 500-year nuclear bombing campaign then began in order to crush the rebels and cleanse the world with atomic fire. This bombing campaign resulted in the reclassification of the planet as a death world, as well as the formation of the now infamous Death Corps of Krieg.